The Waveswarm is an all-analogue module for the Eurorack modular format. It's 14 HP in size and is available in either a black or a silver front panel. It's designed to take a triangle or a sawtooth wave from a VCO and use it to emulate up to 12 VCOs stacked together in unison. It simulates VCOs that are running at slightly different frequencies, which gives you that thick, fat characteristic of multiple VCOs tuned at the same pitch with just minute variation between them. It's configured as 2 channels of 6 animators, and their outputs can be summed so that all 12 animators are available to one input signal. However, because they're 2 completely independent channels, they can be used to process 2 VCOs simultaneously. The Waveswarm isn't intended as a performance module, in so much as it's not something you'd want to tweak live like you would perhaps a filter. The best results come from experimenting by gradually adding the individual animators to your incoming waveforms and fine-tuning them until you get a result that you're happy with, and then leaving it set up. That at least makes more musical sense. But as you'll see later, you can achieve very subtle results, but you can also overdrive it and really mash up your incoming signals as well. The Waveswarm has 2 separate inputs, input A and input B, which address the 2 separate channels of the Waveswarm, but the inputs are normaled, so if you have just one VCO connected to input A, that signal is automatically carried into both channels. There are also independent outputs for both channels, output A and output B, along with a summed output, which gives you a 50-50 mix of both together. So this is what the module looks like outside of the case. As you can see, it's nice and shallow, and on the back this is your power connector, and it's really important to get this right, because if you connect this wrongly, as with any other modules, you could do serious damage to your equipment. Now the AJH system follows a pattern of having the -12 volt pin at the bottom here. On the Eurorack cables, you'll see that there's this red stripe on the bottom, and that generally relates to, or is intended to connect to, the -12 volt rail. So if you position this like that so the red stripe is down, and gently push it on, never force them. One thing you've got to bear in mind is that all cases and bus boards by different manufacturers are going to look a little bit different, but they still follow the same principle, and in most cases with bus boards it will be marked what each one of the pins does, and the -12 volt rail will be clearly marked at the bottom. Like on this Durfer rail you can see -12 volt, so, and they all follow the same format. In their cases that you buy complete, then they're generally laid out like that with a 12 volt rail at the bottom. I've actually built this case from scratch, but I've used the Durfer boards in the same orientation just to save confusion. You might also be using flying bus cables, in which case they're generally shrouded, which means they've got a plastic surround that will only allow you to connect the cable in a certain direction. But either way, always make sure that you're absolutely certain that you're putting the cables in the right way. I generally like to connect a cable to the bus board first, because it's a little bit more cumbersome when you've got the other end attached to the module, so it's just a little bit easier and you're less likely to drop something or hit something. So making sure you've got the red stripe down, because the -12 volt rail is at the bottom, and just really gently feel around until it looks like, well, it feels like the connector is just going to slide on, but never force it. And when you feel pretty sure it's in place, just give it a little bit of a light press just to make sure it's seated properly. I've had cases with bus boards in the past where someone's obviously tried forcing it in there, not got it lined up properly, and they've broken the pins, which means that connector has then it's not usable anymore. So be very careful with that. Then the other end, again, red stripe down on the back of the module. Just lightly push it in. I quite often use ties as well to just gather up a bit of the slack on the cables. I mean, they all come in different lengths as well, but it just keeps them tidy, which means they're less likely to be pressing against anything and gives you a bit more airflow in the case. But just for this example, I'm just going to leave it like that. And then I use these little, you won't see this on the video, but I use these little white or clear washers over the top of the screws. It protects the front panel so that when I'm screwing it in, I'm not scraping metal against the front of the panel, and that just keeps them looking nice. The module is designed to appear in a very specific place in the audio chain. It expects to receive either a triangle, a sawtooth, or even a sine wave from an oscillator, whether it be an analog oscillator or a digital oscillator. It doesn't work with square waves, and it definitely doesn't work with audio. If you put an audio signal into it, you'll just get something pretty undesirable come out the other end. That's not its job. And also, if you plug nothing in, you'll just get a clicking noise. So it really is dependent on those specific signals from a VCO. It might be tempting to look at this and think of it as an effects processor, but it's not. It's very much specifically designed to accompany analog or digital oscillators in very specific waveforms. So it's not like an audio processor. So if I start to connect this up, first of all, take the saw wave, plug it into input A, and then connect my output to the first input of the ladder filter. I'm using the ladder filter like a mixer. It's got this really great feature that I love, these 3 inputs with attenuators, so you can basically, you've got a 3-channel mixer in the filter itself. So I'll be using that at various points in the video. So starting with a single VCO, and this is a sawtooth wave going into input A. If I raise the level, when you get to about 50%, that's kind of the optimum volume level. If you start to go higher than that, it will start to drive the signal. The top 12 pots control the volume of the individual animators. So if I start by just adding 2 of them, so that's just one animator now. That's kind of what the effect you get if you had 2 VCOs going into the same filter or whatever, but were tuned very slightly differently. So they're just sort of rubbing against each other, which creates that thick sound. So it's thickened up the sound quite a lot. And then you generally want to fine tune these by ear until you hear the relationship between the different animators behave in a way that's complementary. So if you notice on the names of the pots, they're divided into 2 banks ending in A and B, because it can be used as 2 separate channels, 2 separate animators. In this case, I've got it set up so that I've got access to all 12 on a single VCO, because I've just got the sound of a single VCO going into input A. Input A is then normaled across both channels, and then I can take both channels out on this A plus B output. Now all the animators, including those on A and B, are different. They all run at different speeds, or slightly different frequencies. That's important because if you imagine if you had two VCOs that were absolutely perfectly tuned, you wouldn't hear any distinction between them. It's only when they're just slightly out of tune with each other that you hear that kind of movement in the sound. That's sort of almost like a pulse width modulation sort of effect. And so by adding these, you're effectively adding or simulating an additional oscillator up to 12, which obviously can make a very big, thick sound. Here I've set it up with 12 animators going at the same time, and just had to finally adjust each one just to get the right kind of sound I was looking for, so that they seemed a little bit more harmonious with each other. So I've multiplied the output from the VCO by using one of these handy little things, and I've got both the signal coming out of the waveform going into one input of the filter and the original sawtooth wave unaffected going into the second input on the filter's mixer. So if I lower the volume of the waveform and then raise sawtooth, you can hear what it sounds like without the waveform. That's just the original sawtooth wave on its own. Just to remind you what it sounds like. I'll take that back down again. You might not necessarily need to use all of the animators. It really depends what kind of effect you're going to get, so it's worth experimenting with just using one or two or any number. And also the way they respond to VCOs is going to be different, because each VCO is inherently going to have a different character of sound, even if it's just an identical kind of waveform. So two VCOs will have a different sounding sawtooth or a different sounding triangle and so on. So the waveform will react differently, the results you'll get will be different. So don't expect to put a different VCO into the waveform and get exactly the same output, because they will be different. So this is just a dry signal from the triangle wave at the moment, but if I increase the input level, you'll hear it start to overdrive. LED lights up to tell you that you're driving the signal, which is nice and helpful. So yeah, back to about 50%, and I'll add some animators and see what it does to the signal. So already that's changed the character of the sound significantly and made it sound a lot more interesting and a lot bigger. I'm using two mini-mod VCOs, but you could use any VCOs so long as the output of them is Eurorack level, which is just the standard in Eurorack anyway, and also the waveforms have to be bipolar, which means they have to output a +5 volt to -5 volt signal. That constitutes the vast majority of VCOs, certainly all those I've seen, so you're unlikely to find anything that deviates from that, because that is the standard for Eurorack. So in this instance I'm using the triangle wave and just one channel to start with of the waveform, so you can hear what it sounds like with just the 6 animators on channel A. So if I start to add just 2, you can hear that it creates a lot of harmonics on the triangle wave, which is normally very flat sounding, and it sounds like a couple of VCOs just sort of rubbing against each other. And as I add more, the sound will thicken up. So that's a nice thick tone just coming from one VCO and one channel of the waveform. But if I take another VCO, again with the triangle wave, and put it into channel B, and then output that from output B into the filter as well. Now I'll turn the first channel down so you can hear just channel B. And then do the same thing as I did with channel A. And that's just the second VCO going through channel B. And if I add the two of them together by raising the volume of channel A, and then I'll kick one of the VCOs up an octave. And to illustrate this another way, I've just got a simple bass line, and at the moment all we can hear is the second VCO going through channel B with all the animators turned down. And if I bring in channel A, and raise the animators on channel B as well. And this is just the two VCOs on their own with all the animators turned down, and as you can hear there's a little bit of movement in the sound because the VCOs aren't perfectly tuned, so they're creating that sort of thicker, more interesting sound. Well, the waveform is basically working on the principle of multiplying that effect by up to 12. You can raise the levels of the individual animators to levels that aren't complementary and or even a greater volume in the input, and even so they start driving the sound of the module. So you see the drive B lights flashing and it's much louder and it's got that constant beating, which might well appeal to some people. The drive feature on the waveform makes it possible to achieve some very musical saturation. And I'm going to start with just the triangle wave from both VCOs going into both channels of the waveform, and then listeners will start to make the channels